So last week, George R. R. Martin released a blog post congratulating House of the Dragon on their Saturn Award win for Season 2. He also didn't seem to realize that Game of Thrones had won several of these in the past and proceeded to give late congrats to those people as well. But eagle-eyed fans noticed one thing missing about his congratulations. House of the Dragon showrunner Ryan Condal isn't mentioned, not even once. In fact, he mentioned Dave and Dan more than he did Condal. And you guys remember Dave and Dan, right? Showrunners for Game of Thrones, the guys who supposedly ruined the series with that terrible ending. Well, it turns out George may have a bit more respect for those two than he does for Ryan Condal. And if you think I'm exaggerating on that, well, take a seat and we'll go down that rabbit hole together. And before we get started, please be sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and consider supporting us on Patreon or YouTube memberships, because Lord knows, HBO won't be happy with this video either. Let's get into it. Before we go down this rabbit hole, let's do a quick spicy recap. During the time that House of the Dragon Season 2 was airing, George was blogging about it and gave some positive reviews. He then ventures on over to the UK during the rest of the season, and while over there, he apparently discusses, quite loudly, with some of his fellow writers, his dislike on how Ryan Condal is handling the material. When George comes back to the US, he attends Bubonicon, where he, again, tells a crowd of people that he wasn't too keen on how House of the Dragon was moving along. Shortly after, he releases his infamous Toxic Butterflies blog post, complaining that House of the Dragon was not going the way he'd hoped, and called out Ryan Condal specifically. George then soon deleted that post, and soon after, the writer that George hung out with came to his defense and shed some light on the situation, highlighting that the writer's room weren't really listening to his ideas, outright dismissing any input he had, and you could argue that's fairly disrespectful, especially considering they're his stories. These people have a job because of George. But regardless, I've covered these events extensively on this channel, and I'll leave a link in the description below to those videos if you want to check them out. And I highly recommend the Bubonicon video I did because we got the exclusive from someone who attended the event, and it's something you won't find anywhere else. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, come on, George not mentioning Condal doesn't mean their feud is still on. Well, in that same blog post, he mentions Matt Smith and Emma Darcy, who were nominated for a Saturn Award, and they didn't even win, and still got a mention. Season 2 won an actual award and not one mention of the showrunner or writer on staff. Game of Thrones won 6 years ago, and he went out of his way to congratulate the showrunners, the writers, the actors, and I think he even mentioned the Uber Eats guy in there for some reason. Everyone's getting a thank you except Condal. Oh yeah, it's still on. Now, for our more impatient viewers out there, you're probably wondering, how does Winds of Winter factor into all this? Well, Felicia, we're getting there. It's no secret that most people in the fandom are not big fans of Dave and Dan, specifically because of how they ended Game of Thrones. I'm sure most logical people would agree that House of the Dragon Season 2, while it had its issues, was not worse than Season 8. Not even close. Season 8 was just on another level of bad. Hell, some people have even argued that Season 8 was so bad that it ruined the series for them, and others have come to the conclusion that it was so bad, George is actively rewriting the books to change how they end, and that's what's taking him so long, and yet George is still out here praising Dave and Dan, but won't even mention Condal. Interesting. What does that tell us? Well, two things. The first being that Condal dismissing George in the writer's room was more terrible to him than Drogon burning the Iron Throne and Sam becoming the Grand Maester. Personally, I would be quite upset at those two things with how fucking stupid they were, but that's just me. The second thing it tells us is that, despite us hating Dave and Dan for Season 8, George still has some level of respect for them, and I think it's because they listened and followed his template for the series, while Condal is not. Let me explain. Last week, a Reddit user posted some old blurbs from the Ice and Fire books, and something interesting caught their eye, and they posted about it. And I'm going to read it to you here, so let me know if this sounds familiar to you. Continuing the most imaginative and ambitious epic fantasy since The Lord of the Rings, winter has come at last, and no man can say whether it will ever go again. The wall is broken, the cold dead legions are coming south, and the people of the Southern Kingdoms turn to their queen to protect them. But Daenerys Targaryen is learning what Robert Baratheon learned before her, that it is one thing to win a throne and quite another to sit on one. Before she can hope to defeat the others, Dany knows she must unite the broken realm behind her. Wolf and Lion must hunt together, Maester and Greenseer work as one, all the blood feuds must be put aside, the bitter rivals and sworn enemies join hands. The Winds of Winter tells the story of Dany's fight to save her new one kingdom, of two desperate journeys beyond the known world into the very hearts of ice and fire, and of the final climactic battle at Winterfell with life itself in the balance. So there's a lot to unpack here, but if it sounds like the plot to Season 7 and Season 8, then yeah, you might be onto something. This topic usually makes the rounds on Reddit fairly often and has for years, but I don't really browse the subreddits too often, so I usually miss it unless someone sends it to me, and big shout out to user Seamus Henny for the research done on this. But George has previously said that these synopses on Amazon are bullshit and he doesn't know where they got that stuff. And yes, even though the blurb appears on the Google website, a comment from GameFAQs confirms it originated from Amazon. Personally, I don't believe George when he says this because where else would this random employee get all of this information from? I guess the old Google link never updated or got removed. Again, what does this have to do with Dave and Dan, Condal, and the Winds of Winter? Well, let's connect it. HBO, Ryan Condal, and whoever else in the House of the Dragon writers' room outright disrespected George by dismissing his ideas on how to adapt his material to the show. Since then, George has been fairly open about his distaste for the people behind the scenes, commenting on it at least 3 times, and yet, despite House of the Dragon's success, he still praises Dave and Dan, who supposedly ruined his story by doing their own thing. But actually, no. It's quite the opposite. Dave and Dan, if these original blurbs are anything to go by, follow George's ideas to the letter. At least his original ideas. Again, he says he doesn't know where people got that from, but it's clear that it came from him, and we know that George changes his mind on what the final version will be, so it's possible that George sent this in for review and then changed his mind later. Regardless, we know that there was an infamous sit-down between George, the showrunners, Dave and Dan, and a few others, where he gave them an outline of where the story was going to go. Bran becomes king, hold a door, etc., etc. As fans, we just assume Dave and Dan filled in some of the gaps with their own original ideas, which sucked. And while I still think that's true, the amount of original ideas from them was not as many as we originally thought. It's possible that Dave and Dan used George's original ideas because they knew that Winds wasn't coming anytime soon, and in hindsight, they were correct, and they needed to finish the show. George respects them because they listened to him. They didn't dismiss him, even if they disagreed with some of his bad ideas. Which ideas were George and which were Dave and Dan's? Well,
I guess we'll never know.
But in regards to Winds of Winter, I'm more inclined now to believe that George is changing up the story a bit based off the reception to the last few seasons of Game of Thrones. Elio Garcia, George's co-writer and friend, argues that what's been keeping George up at night with Winds is him trying to put himself in a position where Dream of Spring is the last book, and that requires a bit of work before he gets there. But that itself is a whole nother video I'm working on. And for those of you wondering, well, perhaps George changed his mind and changed the story up years ago, and yeah, of course that's possible. In the original story, there was a love triangle between Arya, Jon, and Tyrion. Hell, there was even a boss battle between Robb and Joffrey. So, yes, this blurb may have been an old idea, but here's the thing. Again, Dave and Dan needed to finish one of the most profitable and expensive television shows ever made, and in order to do that, George probably gave them some of his old ideas to finish it out, since he wasn't writing anything new. And well, Dave and Dan, again, listened to him and did what they could. Of course, this is all speculation, and I'm probably wrong about half of this, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Also, if you'd like to hear our discussion on the original blurbs, Preston and I have a whole podcast dedicated to that over on Patreon and YouTube memberships. It's only $1 for an access, and you'll be helping out the channel in the process. I'll leave you guys with a clip from that discussion after this so you can get a feel of what we discussed. So if you're still with me, thank you so much for watching, and for leaving a like, comment, all that good stuff, and I'll see you all next time. Enjoy. And we are back to talk about an interesting topic that's popped up lately, and this topic is weird because it pops up every now and then, and for some reason it always flies under the radar. Have you heard about the original blurb for Winds of Winter that kind of spoiled the show?
I have. It's gotten very, very little attention. It's I've seen very little about it, but it's mainly because so many things come from like the publishers and about, you know, release dates. And so people kind of go, oh, right. And then the release date never happens. And so everybody kind of thinks, well, what appears on publishing websites is kind of irrelevant. Like there's so many cry wolf situations that people kind of ignore it. But this is a situation that is a little different.
So basically what's going on is that Reddit user Seamus Henney put out a post highlighting some of the original blurbs for the Ice and Fire books, and some of it contains spoiler material that connects to what we see in later on seasons in the television show. Now I know some of you people are probably rolling your eyes at this because, the show, but I promise it'll add up in a minute. But this is what it says on the back of the advance copy for the first book. For those of you wondering, advance copy is something publishers push out to bookshops and reviewers to hype up the series. It says, long ago, in a time forgotten, a perpetual event threw the seasons out of balance. Now, in a land where summers can last decades and winters a lifetime, lords and ladies, soldiers and sorcerers, assassins and bastards come together in a time of grim omens. At the center of the conflict lie the Starks of Winterfell, a family as harsh and unyielding as the frozen land they were born to. Amidst plots and counterplots, tragedy and betrayal, victory and terror, the fate of the Starks, their allies, and their enemies hang perilously in the balance, as faction after faction endeavors to win the deadliest of conflicts, the Game of Thrones. And I'll admit that that's pretty cool, but it gets interesting as we go along, because it looks here that they had a synopsis for A Feast for Crows in 2002.
This is a little odd. I don't know if he means, because in 2002 George had planned on calling A Feast for Crows A Dance with Dragons. Maybe by May. You know what? By May 2002, I think maybe he decided that A Feast for Crows was going to be that. I'm trying to think like when he got rid of when he dropped the 5-year gap. No, I think by 2002 it was A Feast for Crows. I correct myself. Okay.
So it reads as follows.
Yeah.
Continuing the most ambitious and imaginative epic fantasy since The Lord of the Rings, the action book in Book 4 of A Song of Ice and Fire begins the day after the end of A Storm of Swords. While the remaining Northern Lords war endlessly with each other and the Iron Men of the Isles attack the Dreadfort, Sansa becomes a skilled player in the Game of Thrones with Littlefinger as her mentor, Arya a skilled assassin, and Bran a magician and shapeshifter of great power. All seek to gain revenge for the death of their parents and Robb Stark, whose head was cut off and replaced with the head of his direwolf, Fala Morghulis. All men must die, and wolves too. Daenerys trains her growing dragons and learns from Barristan the secrets of her father, her brother Rhaegar, and other matters that will culminate at Starfell. Yes, you heard that correctly. Starfell, not Starfall.
Yeah. The Starfell instead of Starfall, yeah.
And Jon Snow is the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. The wall is his, the night is dark, and he has King Stannis to face. The cold wind is rising, and there are inhuman powers gathering in the north. According to this, George R. Martin confirmed that, this synopsis was based on older material sent to his publisher before he cut the 5-year gap out.
There's so much to unpack on this one. In fact, I think there might be more to unpack here than the later The Winds of Winter one coming. But there's so much to unpack here. So keep in mind, this is May 2002. So George has abandoned the 5-year gap, and in place of the 5-year gap, he was going to have A Feast for Crows, which is essentially his original plan was to make the 5 years, like all the events that were going to happen in the 5-year gaps happen in a book. That didn't happen. Of course, the time period got shorter, and then he split the books in two, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. But there's so many little things in here that I think are really interesting.